really pleasantly surprised to see we have people from as far as New York State and New York City. So this is kind of cool. So I think we are at noon, and I think we are going to start. Remember that this presentation is also recorded, and it's available for you as a member or after the meeting through a video. So, project stakeholder management. This is a pretty intense sections of the PMBOK. It is the last one, not necessarily the last one in importance, but it is the latest one, I would say, that was developed by PMI. And it's really very important, and it's getting bigger, even in the new version that we're going to see next week. So for those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Gabrielle Haskins. I am the president and the CEO of the PMI MCAC, as well as project management executive, which is my company. And I do a lot of training, and I'm a senior portfolio manager in my everyday life. Let's start with, again, the project management context. So stakeholder management is really important, and this is basically where everything else we talked about before also will kind of come to fruition and kind of comes to make sense with all the concept and information that we looked at in the previous knowledge area. So the context, again, social, economic, environmental, and cultural, political and physical also is totally related to the stakeholders. Where they come from, what they do, how they think, what their philosophy is influencing everything we do inside an organization, an agency, or a company. So organizational culture, again, is how to understand project management is validated and where everybody's accountable and where the authority is spread. So again, it's how people are thinking, their principles, their concept, and this is carried through, obviously, by the stakeholders. So for us as project managers, it's really important to see, how is my company organized? Who is making decision? Who has the power to do things? And how is this power or responsibility translated and brought to me as a project manager? Do we have a structured project management environment? Are we, in the maturity level that's just beginning to do project management? And where are we in this situation? And what does that mean for me? We saw the different roles that it caused for us, depending on the structure of the company. We also saw how all of this is actually influencing what I'm doing. And this is how all of this is making sense. We also see that the international and political environment also makes a lot of difference. My company or my organization could do a lot of business all over the world. And this could also influence the rules, the regulations, how people see things, what their perspectives are, and how they're going to affect the decision-making that relates to the project and the programs that I'm working on. So for most of us who've been following us since the beginning, and I want to thank again everybody who did, because that's a long process. We've been doing this for 13 weeks now. We can see that we've been through integration. We saw the core processes, which is scope, schedule, cost, and quality. We've been through resource, communication, risk management, and procurement to do today the stakeholder engagement. And for those of you who know, I also do review for the PMBOK and certain standards. I'm also a reviewer for the standard committee. And I really would like, in the following version of the PMBOK, to have the stakeholder section maybe brought up with integration, because we need to know how to integrate, but we also need the environment in which we work with in order to make sense. And because it is at the end of the PMBOK, sometimes it's hard for a lot of project managers to understand or even go there and understand how it means. What does it mean for me to do stakeholder management? So if you remember, when we talked about the process group, in the initiating process group, we had to develop the project charter, and which was usually signed by the sponsor or the champion. And we also have to identify the stakeholders, because you need the overall big pictures of who's who gives me responsibility, who has to sign for what, where, and when. And that was the first step for the project stakeholder management. After we figure out who they are and how we can identify them and hopefully figure out what kind of categories they're in and how is that affecting my project, because remember, we always look at this from the project perspective. We also want to make sure that we understand, how do we plan? How do we do an engagement plan? And this is a major change from those of you who've been to version 5 or other version of the PMBOK. We used to be able to manage stakeholders. Guess what? Over time, we realized that it's hard to manage people that are above you in the organization. And it's also hard to manage people that are usually at the same level. So the best thing we can do as project managers is to engage the stakeholders. What do we need from them? What is their role and responsibility? And how do we keep them interested, informed about what's going on, and making sure they provide us with the support that we need? Because that's what more major stakeholders and most of the stakeholders will do for the project. They are supporting, they're the environment, the ecosystem, if you want, of the project that we work on. And then we also have to manage that stakeholder engagement. So we're going to find out who they are, what can we do to get their attention sometimes, their support, and so on and so forth. But then we also have to say, are we using the proper tool? What are the tools, the artifacts, or whatever we have to make sure we can manage this engagement and keep it working and see if it's working or not. And then if it's not working, to find something better. And then we also have to monitor that engagement as we're executing the project itself. And then at the end, hopefully, through the lesson learned, we'll figure out, can we do it better next time? And how can we do that? So one thing I really would like to emphasize is for stakeholder engagement. It used to be, for those of you who've been project managers for many years, it used to be part of communication. We only manage stakeholder through communication or some of the resource of the project. It's only recently, I would say for the last version of the PMBOK, that we really have a whole section dedicated to stakeholders, who they are, what they do, how can we get them involved and engaged. And you're going to see that a lot of the tools that we are suggested to use are actually not coming from project management. They're coming from science like psychology or sociology or other kind of science that some of us or most of us were not necessarily familiar with. So it's a learning curve for most of us to see, how do we do this? How can we manage this? And how do I get myself more knowledgeable on what are the tools for me to use and understand the stakeholder? So the first thing about this process is to understand and identify the stakeholders. Who are they? And they could change. We usually, when we work on different programs or different projects, we try to identify all the different stakeholders, which means anyone who has a stake in the project will be identified. And then we reassign for each project which one are specific to this one and this other one. It really helps to figure out who they are. But some people ask, how many stakeholders do I have to identify? Well, the answer is, it depends. It is going to be as many as you think is necessary to support the project while you're working on it. And then you have to plan for the stakeholder engagement. So this is really, how do we develop an approach? First of all, we should know who they are. And we also need to see what is their needs, where there's expectation, then interest, and their potential impact on the project. So for most of us, we know that when we are given a project, this project belongs to the stakeholders, right? So those are the people who are looking to get something done. But we don't necessarily have all this wonderful groups of people agree. Everybody looks at it from their perspective. They have their own objective. They have their own things they want to get done. And our role most of the time is to try to be in between, trying to make sense, try to get people to agree, try to negotiate. And that's really where, on top of that, we have to figure out a way to get them engaged in this process. How do we help ourselves and our team to understand the impact they have on the project and their expectation? Because this is everything we need to manage while we're executing the project itself and making become reality. The process also of managing stakeholder engagement is, how do we communicate with them? Most of those people, if you go to high-level stakeholders, for example, are very busy. So they will probably require dashboards and different things in a specific way so they can have the proper attention to what their role is in helping us do what it is. Some people like a lot of details. Most people just want to know, what do you need me to do to help you so I can move on to all the other things that I have to do that's already sitting on my desk? And we're going to see what that looks like. And when we look at some of the tools. And you also want to figure out, how do we foster stakeholder engagement? Because most people are busy. My project could be just one out of X numbers of projects. How do I create enough interest so that at least if I need help, they know what it is and how they can help me? You also monitor the stakeholder engagement by trying to see, how do we manage those relationships? Stakeholder management is all about relationship, understanding the people, understanding the relationship, understanding how do we fit in that big scenario, and how do we make sure that those people know exactly what to do to help when we need to. And again, because project will evolve, and during the execution of the project, you might have different stakeholders. Just to give you an example, when I was working again for CMS, we had created an ecosystem, and we also realized that a lot of the stakeholders, some of them will give us the contract or the agreement, some other people will give us the requirements, what we want this application or this system to do, and other people would pay for it. So all those stakeholders had the same goal, but they looked at it in a very different perspective. The budget people did not necessarily care or wanted to know about the user agreement, but they wanted to make sure that we respected the budget and that everything was according to whatever they agreed to give us as money was required. So we were the one who had to go through all those stakeholders and make sure that everything agrees, that with the money we have, we can do what we were expected to do, and so on and so forth. So it's a lot of work for the PM at that level. So what we need to do is, first of all, identify our stakeholders, plan stakeholder engagement, and come up with a stakeholder engagement plan. Basically, manage that plan as best we can with the resource that we have. And then we have to monitor and see if whatever we plan for is working. Are we getting the engagement? Is it the proper tools? Did we really identify the stakeholders' power and influence the right way? And if not, what is the best possible way for us to communicate with those people? The one thing that you need to understand also is stakeholder management is not a single-ended job from just the project manager. This is a team effort. You have to work with your team and sometimes some of the other stakeholders, because relationship and influence is all about who you know and how do we work with the people that we know. And sometimes it's easier to work with, different groups of people, or maybe some people can address, the need in a different way that makes it a little bit easier for the stakeholder to understand. So a lot of negotiation and communication is required. And again, why do we care so much about the stakeholders? How did it become something that was part of the team and that we need to communicate in a different way to something that became a whole section by itself? Well, we also realize that stakeholders are the key success factor for the projects. We are building something, creating something for the stakeholders, and their influence and impacts are absolutely critical. If we don't get the people on our side, or we don't understand exactly what they want and how they want it, this thing is not going to work. And that's why we're trying to find all kinds of ways to understand better, because we are putting in place something that somebody else imagined or wanted to create. And our job is to understand them to the best we can. That's why it's also an iterative process. So it's not like you have a picture of all those people like a Polaroid, and then you can say, oh, this is it, it's never going to move. Unfortunately, no. Stakeholders will change as you move. Different groups of people will have responsibility at different level, at different phase of the project. And you have to review routinely everything that you do to make sure that you keep track of that. So when I was working with Pratt & Whitney, we also worked with the Japanese, and they used to say, you have to take the pulse of your stakeholders on a regular basis. Actually, they were saying that you should take it every day. So I guess nowadays, we're also going to have to get their temperature and see how they feel today. So make sure they don't sneeze. Sorry, that's my pandemic humor for today. What is the role of the project manager? Remember, we are responsible for managing the entirety of the project. So we also serve as a liaison between all the different stakeholders. This is what we need to do. And this is where it takes all of its sense, if you want that. This is what our role becomes absolutely crucial. That's why also when you start initiating, you have to do the project charter and the stakeholders, because you need to have in your charter the authority and responsibility that is assigned to you by the stakeholders. Those are the people who are going to tell you, yes, you are responsible for X, Y, Z. We give you authority to do 1, 2, 3, or we don't. And this is also part of the engagement in a way. And if it's signed and agreed to, that's why it's important to get a charter, because it really puts the ground rules. It puts the information there. Roles and responsibility are defined as much as you possibly can, starting with. And then you also know what to do in case, can you manage the resource? Are you responsible for the budget? All that kind of thing. And this is really important. Are you the only point of contact for those stakeholders? Because the more, the higher, I would say, in the hierarchy of the company, or the busier those people are, they do not want to talk to 25 people. And you as a PM, you don't want to have to talk to 25 people to get the answer to the questions that you need answered today. Same thing with the stakeholders. Roles and responsibility, the charter is crucial, and the stakeholder liaison role is absolutely important. That's really the lifeline of your project. Stakeholders could be individuals, they could be organization, and as a definition, it's anyone and everyone who has a stake in the project. A lot of people, the answer is yes, lots of people. You better have more than less. You can always take people off and validate with your team if you really need to. But in a lot of cases, even the people who are just have a slight interest in your project might need to be informed of the progress of the project. So that's why you need to include a lot of people, if not everyone. They're also going to have various levels of involvement, different phase of the project. Some of them will be responsible to do approval for certain requirements, for certain parts of the process. Those might be the people who just come in, sign for this one, have specific information, and then they go away. Other people might need to have a lot of pictures of everything that's going on. And some people who might not have any specific interest, like they might not provide the budget or sign for anything, but they're curious because maybe they want to do something similar in their own agency or their own group. So they might be looking at your project as a stakeholder with a lot of interest. And again, each one of them may be affected by the execution or the completion of the project. Their tolerance to risk is really, really important. And what I see as a trend in a lot of organizations, stakeholder and risk management are now being looked at very closely. People look at this together because guess what? Your tolerance to risk or your intolerance to risk is going to affect directly your decision-making during the process. They will agree to certain things or will not agree to certain things, will give you money to move forward, will say, nope, sorry, this project is done. So they do have life and death responsibility on your project. That's really, really important. And many years ago, I created the stakeholder matrix that's a little bit different than the one that PMI does when we look at the internal and external stakeholders, as well as the invisible stakeholders and all that kind of stuff, because this is when you're inside an organization, you need to know in a graphical way. I like graphics. Who is responsible for what and who is influencing other people? Because some people might have a lot of influence, more than you think, on the decision of that person that you are dealing with directly. Very important things for us to know, because it could make your project live or it can kill the project and you won't even know what happened to you. Sponsors and major stakeholders with high power, they need to be engaged. They need to figure out the appropriate amount of communication they need to support your project. If you don't give it to them or you cannot find a way to get them interested, they're just going to sign whatever you give them. Or sometimes you can wait for days and weeks to get the approval for anything that was necessary for you yesterday. They might assist in funding and clarifying scope, and they can influence others for the benefit of the project, or sometimes for the benefit of their own If someone doesn't want your project to work because they, for some reason, want to have money, and I know it doesn't happen in your world, but it happens in mine sometimes, that could be influencing too. When, we manage resources that are scarce for everyone. We have the same resource, the same people, the same money to do everything. So don't discount the fact that some other people might have different interests that could be beneficial for your project or maybe not. So one of the most important things that you need to do, and at this point, you know that we need to do a lot of register. Like we had a risk register, we had a requirements register. We also need the stakeholder register. That's something that should have come from the stakeholder identification in the initiation phase. There's so many different variations of this chart that I was trying to find one that would make sense, but I gave you just this basic one. I'm sure you must have some. If you don't, you can also reach out to me. There's many different variations of this. What I usually do is I do it in Excel, in an Excel workbook, not just in an Excel sheet. And I usually have all kinds of stakeholders, and I can add my needs, my priority, my roles and responsibility, my communication needs, if they're related to any kind of requirements or deliverables approval. I create all of this in a huge, giant Excel sheet. There's many different pages you can use, and you can also use the pivot table to show to a very specific group what exactly you want to do. So we also created some of this in a database, but Excel is still a very good use. But that's basically what you need to know. You need to have a stakeholder register, and it has to include all your stakeholders. They could be in categories, depending on if it makes sense for you, like higher leadership, management, whatever makes sense for your organization. But make sure that you put everyone in there, and just, select and pick the one that you need for every specific project. If you have a PMO or an ePMO, they also might have something similar to that you can request and see, do we have a list of all the stakeholders for my specific project? And more companies in ePMO and PMO are working on that sense. So you, as a PM, can have the list of the stakeholders that are identified, at least for your project, but you should also have access to the entire list of the stakeholders. Stakeholder identification matrix, this is a basic one where you have the stakeholders, you can have the interest and influence, sometimes a unique information about them, their role, and the strategic approach that you would have. So how do we do this kind of stuff? This was also one of the, I put this one in there because that was one of the fewest versions when we tried to see, we are going to try to define a strategy to say, how do we do this? But we came out with a new version of the PMBOK, which says, we're trying to look with the tools, like I mentioned before, that came from psychology and sociology. We had much better tools because those people do this all the time. They work with people, they have statistics, they can categorize groups of people. So I'll show you some of those tools that can help. A lot of them are available. It takes a little bit of a learning curve to figure out how to make them work, but they are very useful because this is really your roadmap that you built with your team to know who those people are, what they do in my project, and what are the unique information or the things that I need about them to know, and how can I address the strategy? And then, of course, there's going to be a lot of discussion and conversation about all of this, but you also have to have different people because you need to have different perspective on how this person is acting or reacting and what's the best way to get their interest. Some of the trends and practices that we see a lot today. You need to identify all the stakeholders. That's what I've been saying for the last couple of minutes. Make sure you involve all the teams in your stakeholder engagement, not just yourself. You might have other people who, for example, I've worked on a project with that sponsor or that stakeholder, and they might know exactly how those people act and how they want it to be communicated with. They know how to reach out to them. I think this is really important for you to know. And review the stakeholders in parallel with the project risk, always. We even start now to have the charter where we identify as the high-level risk the area or the stakeholder group that could be affected by it. So this way you're kind of pre-doing the work to know where to go when you need to do risk approval or if you want to really validate that this is a risk. The co-creation concept comes with the fact that you try to create early engagement with key stakeholders. Nothing in project management ever prevented us from doing that. But in a lot of cases, companies are, providing project managers with the minimum information, and then you just go and run with the ball. So this concept is really to trying to say, hey, the stakeholders are the people who want this. Try to figure out to the best you can the tools that can help you get them engaged as early as possible and keep them engaged if they need to be all along with your project by giving them the right information in the right format at the right time. Try to capture the positive and the negative value of the stakeholder engagement. Sometimes, remember, this is fairly new for most of us in many ways. So you're going to try different things. Don't be afraid to try. If it works, fine. If it doesn't work, feel free to modify or try to do something else. We have to be, structured, but at the same time creative in understanding stakeholder management to the best we can. We also need to tailor consideration. We're going to see, and again, for those of you who've been through the beginning, and we're going to start again in August, tailoring is a really important role now for project managers. They expect project managers to be able to know the tools and the techniques and to use them to the appropriate format and projects that they work on. Understanding that stakeholder diversity, they come from different environment. If you work with a company like I do that's global, you're going to work with people who are coming from different countries, different parts of the world, and they look at things in a very different way. And you have to be able to understand. You also have a complexity of relationships. Many different organizations have hierarchy that are very different. Some of us work in environments where it's very open. Anybody can ask any question to anybody. I work a lot. I work in 14 different countries. I can tell you that there are places where it doesn't work that way. Hierarchy is really important. You have to follow the step. And this is the way it is. You don't change it because yours is different. You just try to accommodate and try to understand and see if you can work with it. Communication and technology channels. We saw in communication that the more channel we have, and that grows exponentially pretty fast, it's important to know that a lot of things are going to travel beyond what you're sending to people, to other people that are related. And remember the phone game, right? Might start in one version of it, and whatever goes to the other end might be totally different. So be mindful of that. Understand how communication travels in your company, your organization, or your department, and be mindful of how is this going to go one way or the other. With the Agile opportunity right now, we are trying to get more frequent involvement. It's not new, but it's something that is trying to be embedded in this process. Try to get also aggressive transparency, which is kind of interesting because in my experience, everybody wants to have transparency as long as it's not showing in their world, because then when you show transparency, sometimes it scares the daylight out of people. So be careful with that. We want to have graphical representation. We want to make sure that people understand what's going on. But again, some people might think it's risky. Some people might not want you to show all the details. So again, we go back to the risk portion and visual display of ongoing results. I've been in environments where people absolutely love it, and I've been in other environments where people are like, they kind of have to grow quietly into this before they find it acceptable. And you work in some environments like finance and banking, where sometimes you don't necessarily have the ability, because of confidentiality and all kinds of stuff where you can share all of that. So how do we do the stakeholder engagements? Once we figure out who they are, we have to also identify what are the things that drives those people. How can I create engagement for those down? I also have to prioritize because I cannot do everything for everyone. We need to know what can be done for groups of people. And that's why we usually regroup the stakeholders in different categories and different groups, because it's going to be a little bit easier for us to manage. And how, again, do we manage this and map those information that we have about them? So again, to make your life a little bit easier. And then you have to physically engage with them, meetings, communication, whatever works best. And then you have to monitor and see if this is really giving you the results that you have. Same thing. Remember we talked about a PDCA early? It is the exact same thing. Some of the tools and techniques, remember we have 125 of them, so there's a lot. But one of the things in stakeholder engagement that's really important is the expert judgment. It means you need to talk to people in your company or organization that understand the power in politics in your organization. You need to be very much aware of the environmental factors and the external stakeholders. What is the industry that you work with? What is acceptable and not acceptable in this environment, internally and externally? And then you need a lot of subject matter expert, technical, business, industry, and team to help you manage all this information. You do a lot of data gathering because you do brainstorming and questionnaires and surveys because you don't necessarily have this information. You know, we've got resume, but we do not have copies of, you know, how is my boss thinking about this? And those are the kind of things you have to talk about and figure out as you go. And that's why we do brainstorming and questionnaires and survey and try to work with people to see what is the reaction to certain things that we want them to be sensitive to. Data analysis, so we're going to do the stakeholder analysis very intensely in this section. We also have to see their interests, their rights, their ownership, the knowledge and the contribution they have. And again, my OPA, my policy, my documentations, my governance, all of this are really, really important. And again, this is where everything kind of comes together. Also, one of the things that we liked a lot about the stakeholder engagement tools is there's a lot of data representation because a lot of those are qualitative. Remember, we saw the tools in risk management that was qualitative. A lot of those are observation and they're not necessarily quantified, but we still need to understand, and graphics is a little bit easier sometimes than writing reports that, you know, are really hard to read. So there's some for smaller projects where we do power influence and power impact. And we also have something that's called a stakeholder cube, which is a 3D comparison of that. For a large project, we'll show you a salience model. So is really the power, the urgency, and the legitimacy of the request that you get. And then the direction of influence. Is it upwards or downwards? Is it sideways? And how do I prioritize? And how do I figure this one out through meetings and recommendations? The two things that you also need as a PM, interpersonal skills and team skills are really important. You need to be very knowledgeable about cultural awareness, political awareness, conflict management. We need to know how to do that because most of the stakeholders are not necessarily going to agree upfront about what they want and how it's going to be. They're going to all look at it from their own perspective. Your role is to get everybody together and make sure they get to a common goal because there's not just one person, it's a group of people. So your job is to really create a common understanding. Negotiating and networking, this is what you do in here all the time. Observation and conversation. You have to look and see what's happening. You have to make your opinion, but at the same time, you have to validate those opinions to make sure they make sense. Leadership skills, sometimes you're going to have to say, okay, this is what we do, and this is where we're not going. All of this is really important. Remember, we talked about the ground rules. So the stakeholder, the project charter, the team charter, and the stakeholder charter is also important. Believe it or not, over the years, one of the things that I realized is a lot of the stakeholders, especially the high-level stakeholders, most of them did not really understand their roles and responsibility in a lot of projects. And they didn't know there was ground rules, and they just thought that they were assigned to a project, and that was it. So I know that over time, we created with the charter an understanding that they have ground rules and there's specific things that we want. We want them to be engaged, but we also want to make sure that they agree that this is what we're going to do and that is going to work with them. So don't feel that you cannot propose things to your high-level stakeholders. Tell them exactly what you want their roles and responsibility to be. Allow them to say yes, no, or maybe change some things. But you would be surprised how those people will feel much better about feeling that, okay, I'm engaged. I see there's a role for me. It's not just signing the paper. I have a role and it's important. This is what I'm supposed to do. And a lot of times you're going to get a lot more support if you can figure out a way to make that happen. One of the things that also is really important in the decision-making process is when people cannot agree just on talking to it, then you're going to have to find some kind of modes for them to agree. Voting, multi-criteria decision, anything that can help get the tension away from I agree to disagree to what are the things we can agree with and let's vote and make everybody understand you have to come up to a decision because, is it going to be unanimous? Do we have to have the majority? whatever that process is, because that's about the only way then people feel like, okay, there's a process, it's acceptable for me. And I know that if I do that, my voice will be heard, and so on and so forth. So that's really important, because remember, those stakeholders are powerful. If they don't like the way you do this, they might not like the way you do project management altogether. Who knows? And meetings. When you do meetings with the stakeholders, you also have to understand that most of the time they need to know, what do we want them to do? So is it a decision-making meeting? Is it an issue resolution? Make sure that when you do meetings and all kinds of stuff with them, that they know exactly what the issue is. And remember, in communication, we also said if you do a decision-making issue resolution, you don't have 2,500 people in that room. You should have the very specific stakeholders that you need to make that decision. And you should have enough time for them to have conversation or discussion about it. But then again, less people with more decision-making process usually works best, because you want them to have time to give you their answer, yes or no, or whatever is in between. You also need to have lesson learned and retrospective. They need to know what the influence they have, but they also need to know what the results are, so they can make sense and say, yeah, I agreed to this and this is the results. Or I agreed to this and I'm not sure I like the results out of this one. Make sure they're part of project kickoff and the sprint planning. So this way they're part of the project. It doesn't have to be for a long period of time. Make sure you give them, a couple of minutes to be there at the beginning, at the end. Make sure that their presence is known, but also it is appropriate, and then you give them enough time, so that they can move on to other things if they need to. And they also need to have status update and reviews, because they will need to know what's going on. That's the only way sometimes for them to keep track of it. But again, you have to balance it out. Too much is not better than not enough. You have to really, that's a really tough balance to get. How much information is just enough and not too much? One of the other tools that we really see a lot of tools in this one, so Stakeholder Engagement Assessment Matrix, is really to see, once you get all your stakeholders and you pretty much see what they want, you want to see, are those stakeholders unaware, resistant, neutral, supportive, or are they leading in my project? And the reason why you do this, because again, you want them to approve or support. And you do the current situation, and then you would see what is the desired situation. Based on that, you can also define what kind of strategy eventually you're going to put together. And you can usually agree with your team or other stakeholders to make sure it makes sense. We also talk about risk tolerance a lot. That's, again, extremely important. If you have risk averters, you're going to really make sure that those people are understanding, that you understand why they're risk adverse, and is there anything you can do to move the needle if you need to? What kind of information they might need? What kind of specific resistance do they have? What are the things that you can talk maybe with them? And if there's nothing you can do to change their mind, then you're going to have to come with it and live with it. It's going to become a constraint. And the risk neutral. Sometimes it could be a favorable situation, sometimes not, because maybe the risk is really high for your team, for example, but this person is like, it's okay with me. So again, it's not just the information, it's what you do with it and how you can use this information to help you move forward when you need to in the project. And when you have a risk seeker, in some cases, people are really, it would be the opposite of the first one. The risk averter would say, no, we're not going there. There's nothing that's going to make me change my mind. And the risk seeker would be like, no problem. Let's go. And let's move. But then you know that, for example, if you move too fast, it's not going to work. So again, the balance is somewhere in between those three. But you need to know that very well with your stakeholders. You need to see how they feel about this. And in real life, when we do this, for a whole week, we also have a lot of tools and a lot of exercise and a lot of team exercise that you can do with the stakeholders. That doesn't take too much time, but it helps you understand and themselves how they react to things. One of the tools that's very useful in the stakeholder is the stakeholder powered with interest, influence, and impact. And why do we care about those three tools? Well, I want to know their power, right? And their interest. And every one of those, you also have the one, whenever you got the high power and the high interest, so that right top corner here for this one. So this one you manage closely, power and influence you manage closely, and those three are your major stakeholders. The people who have interest, influence, and impact, of course, ought to be the people that you're going to manage very closely. That should not be a large group of people. But one of the things that you need to know also is if I have people with a lot of impact and a lot of influence, but not a lot of interest because my project is only one out of 300 projects that they have, I have to figure out a way to say, how do I keep them informed so that I can figure out if they can give me the time that I need? What are the things that I can do? And sometimes you cannot necessarily manage them closely, but you can at least keep them satisfied. So this is really important. You need to monitor all of them to see where they are at. And I need to know, again, the power and the impact. A lot of people might have a lot of impact, but not necessarily a lot of power. But you want to make sure that you know who those people are, because they might be talking to those people here, and that puts your project either in a good position or not. So this is a very useful tools for that. Something fairly easy that you can do again in Excel in all kinds of different ways. The other one were for a larger project with a salience model. So this is really a similar model, but it talks about the power, the urgency, and the legitimacy. And what happens in this one is sometimes we do have, like in the other group, people who have a lot of powers, right? But we also have people here. So those people are power, but is it a legitimate power for my project? They might be the VP of something. They might have a lot of power over the company, but they might not necessarily have a lot of power over my project itself. But again, they might create sometimes an urgency because they have the power. So you need to be aware of this and work with this tool on several occasions to figure this one out. But definitely the people here are the small group of people who have the power, and this power, oops, sorry about that. The power is legitimate. And again, they can create urgency. When those people press the red button, you go for it, because those are the people who have life and death power over your project. The people here might have power here, and they might be very demanding, but they're not necessarily legitimate. So what do you do with this? You manage carefully, because those people, have a lot of power here, but they can make a lot of noise, but that's not necessarily going to help your project. So be careful about those kind of stuff. And again, be careful about the word they describe here. The one here, so those are people who are power and they're legitimate, but they can be very dominant on your project, but they might not necessarily have all the rest of your best interest in place. So really, like I said, it's a whole science. It takes a little bit of learning curves to learn how to do that. But it could be very interesting and very useful in your project. And I would say, by all means, you can share this with your stakeholders. This is not meant that you share definitely this with your team and with your stakeholders. So it's not supposed to be, a secret that you have about your team, but it's something that you want to use to understand better. And you can even teach them how to use it too. So people usually like to be able to understand this. The stakeholder cube that we talked about before, basically the same power, interests, but also talk about their attitude. And all of them, those tools are all available online. And that also can be used for risk, because those are people who have the power and the interest, and they could block certain things because they might not feel, comfortable with the way you're addressing the issue, or by the way you're doing the project, or so on and so forth. So this is really how, and usually in real life, this is going to be all color-coded, different tools to find which one you have. I would say try a few, pick the one that works the best for the size of your project, and try to become more familiar with it. Because again, the learning curve for each one of those tools could be significant. The stakeholder mapping, I've used a lot of, before I even knew about the stakeholders, I used to build ecosystem. So this is a format. It doesn't look like this. This one looks like a fried egg actually, but different types of ecosystem that tells you for each activities who are the people and the different groups embedded in this one and who has influence on what. I can tell you that the one we built for CMS was a 6 months effort. It had a lot of data, and everything behind mapping and the ecosystem, had all the technical and the business architecture for each one of them. I was a business solution architect for that. So this is a pretty intense tool. And like I said, there's many different ways that you can do this. I try to use a smaller version of the ecosystem if I go into a program or a portfolio, because that allows me to see in one page where everybody is standing according to each other and who are the major stakeholders. But again, this is something that you need to be familiar with. You know, I have a business process management background and process engineering, so it might not be the same for everyone, but it's feasible. If you have a solution architect in your company, they can help you build one. They probably would be very happy to do so. Other stakeholder mappings was also about for each activities, you can also have specific stakeholders and see how each and every one of them is interacting with everyone. So many different ways of skinning this cat, if you want. Increasing influence of stakeholders, that's called the bubble chart. Many different ways of doing that, depending on the level of influence, the bubble is bigger or smaller. The concentrating of the radar chat, that's another one. If you look at the tools, it could be by sector sometimes, and it would be for specific factors or specific actions in different groups of people. So more specifically, I would say, I don't know if at the project level you would do that, but I would think that the PMO and all those other tools would be part of that. I would definitely use it for portfolio or program management. Again, two-dimension bubble charts, stakeholders of each group. So this is where you compare stakeholders for different characteristics for each one of them. And again, this is the ultimate goal of what I call my super tool. If you really want to impress your stakeholders, you can use this one. It's color-coded, it has all that kind of stuff, but everybody's gonna be, wow, you also need to be able to explain it. But this one could be a lot of fun. Stakeholder register, sorry for the blurry of this slide. So what you want to do for the stakeholder is you all should have your stakeholder register, but you want to use the stakeholder with the, with the issue and the comments for this one and the priority, but you also have the directions, remember, of their influence. You want to know if it's upward, downwards, or so on and so forth. And you also have the power level. You can give it a number, you can give it an index, whatever works. Again, this is qualitative, but you should have that in your stakeholder register. Think about it as a workbook and add the information as you grow into your knowledge of your stakeholders, and reassess whenever you need to. When you manage the stakeholder engagement, you really have to have whatever is needed for every step of the process at every phase. You manage the expectation through negotiation and communication. You're also going to address any risk and potential concern for their facility to helping you. And then you clarify and resolve issues that have been identified. And then again, you also want to help how their contribution will enhance the project's success. That's ultimately what you want to do with that. How do you do that? You will find a strategy that helps positive stakeholder keep satisfied. You try to reduce or eliminate the opposition from the stakeholder, the negative stakeholder as much as you possibly can. You can mitigate the risk where the stakeholders can generate, or at least help with other stakeholders. And again, the role of others outside the groups that you have. See how you can do that. Again, the types of communication that you're going to pick and choose is definitely going to be really helpful in the strategy that you have with the stakeholders. One of the tools that I use is a one-page stakeholder management. This one pretty much is my one-pager for everything. It has my stakeholder names, the definition. We have this little chart that we have there in the assessment. We build the engagement profile, and we also have the communication plan. This could be built in a one-pager and usually owns the relationship. And we also try to see who in my team, who as a team will manage that relationship. You also do this communication and working with the stakeholders. You meet their expectation and needs. You need to address the issue. And then, the most importantly, you need to foster the appropriate involvement. That's always in your mind when you're working with this. Your plan should have everything that you need to manage the stakeholder engagement. And that includes communication, the importance of their influence, power, and everything. And what is this? And you also need to review. Every time there's a new phase of the project, you're going to need to change that because you might have stakeholders. Every time there's a change in your organization or the industry, you're going to have to do that. Anytime you have groups or people changing in and out of your project, that's going to be part of that. And again, when you have risk management, change management, all of this is going to be part. So your stakeholder engagement plan is pretty intense. It will contain a lot of stuff about who those people are, what you want to do, and how you're going to manage their engagement. Some of the tools that we use for them are basically the same as we use for team management team. I'll show you some of the tools like the Myers-Briggs and some of that kind of stuff. For those of you who are familiar with the Myers-Briggs, it's about introvert and extrovert, sensing and intuitive, as well as judging and perceiving. That could be, if it's familiar with you, please use something like this. And the other tools that we use a lot for stakeholder management is conflict management, because those people are high powered, they might not agree, and you're going to be in the middle. What you need to understand is, based on this study, that conflicts is also usually dynamics. There might be history, stories, things that have been there before you were even there that creates the situation where those two people, for some reason, don't want to talk to each other. And you also need to understand it in conflict management. It's not necessarily what they did, but it's the perception of the conflict that is the matter. If people feel that they were badly treated and it was not resolved, they're still going to be in conflict. And again, not all conflicts are bad. It's how we manage the conflicts that can be positive or negative. It could be task-oriented, so maybe you have different perceptions of whatever's going on. You can have administration or process conflict, disagreement on reporting, relationship, and all that kind of stuff. And it could be personal. Some people just work well together, others don't. And sometimes there's not much you can do. When we have time, we do all the standard conflict resolution. But for now, you need to know that confrontation, for example, is actually a win-win, because this is where you put the problem on the table and everybody agrees on a solution that works for everyone. You can be forcing. I'm the boss, you do what I say. Well, somebody win and somebody lose. Compromising, in the definition of the term, is actually we both lose, because I'm like, okay, you win. I don't want to do this anymore. Whatever you agree with. Now we both lose, because we don't want to talk about the real issue and we don't have the energy to talk about how do we look at the real issue. So compromising in that term is lose-lose. You can also withdraw. You have people who are passive aggressive. They're like, no, not doing anything. You're not going to take any away from me. In this case, we all lose again. And you also have people who say, oh, just get together or whatever, just for the sake of the agreement, we do this. Just know, in that case, we also lose-lose. So there's a whole science in negotiation that's really interesting and kind of fun to learn. What are sources of conflicts? Project formation, where we have priorities, and that comes from the stakeholders. And here, when you're early execution, this priority and schedule, this is all related to your stakeholders. And this is what you have to work on it all the time. The other thing that you need to do is problem solving. You're going to have to do that with everybody. You're going to teach your stakeholders how to do that, because they have to define the problem. Identify what the problem is, define it, try to analyze, and then you implement the solution if we can get one. And then you review and confirm. You cannot just leave it open. You have to do problem-solving process with your stakeholders. Do we have dysfunction? Yes, we do. And does it work with the stakeholders? It can happen with your team. It can happen with any group of people that we work with. What's important to understand, and for us to see as PM, is what does it look like? When people don't trust each other, when there's a fear of conflict, I don't want to create trouble, I don't want to talk to, but that people don't trust each other. When there's a lack of commitment, I'm not going to do this, somebody else will take care of it. And I'm not accountable for it, and then I am not paying attention to results, then you know that your team is dysfunctional. If you get the same reaction from your stakeholder, that stakeholder is not engaged. So we're not going to have time to cover all of that, but those are the most important thing we do when you do stakeholder management. We teach them to say, how can we see this and how can we help? Because this is not helping anyone. In this situation, when this is functional, everybody loses. How do we monitor the stakeholder engagement? Well, we need to track and review the project work, right? We need to overall, how do we monitor the progress to the stakeholders? Are we meeting the defined performance analysis? And again, how we implement the corrective actions? Do we have preventive actions? And we able to do what we're supposed to do, and is that helping the stakeholders? Because in some cases, you're going to have to do this as you go. You can always learn about the lesson learned. If you need engagement with the stakeholders for approval, it has to happen. So part of this is learning as you go and be able to apply. And sometimes the more you do it, the better you're going to be at creatively using it in a good way. You're going to need a lot of interpersonal skills. Active listening is key. Cultural awareness is indispensable. Leadership, sometimes you're going to have to be the one that says, okay, we need to vote on this. This is it. We need to move forward. And networking. How do you manage difficult stakeholders? Use your other stakeholders. Use people who know them better than you do. Use the people that they trust in order to help reach out to them. And political awareness. How is my company, my organization works? How is a strategic organization of my company? Some people will change, but it takes a lot of time for people to change. And you're not going to change the politics of your company overnight. It's going to take a long time. Sometimes you'll be more stuck into it. At least you need to understand. One of the other things that's really important, remember we talk about a perception by each stakeholders in risk assessment. There's a bubble chart that can help you do that. How do we understand the risk and the perception of each stakeholder compared to each other? Another tool that can help you understand that. So you can see with this one, you're going to have a lot of graphics and a lot of picture. So what do we need to control? We need to control stakeholder engagement effectiveness, frequency and quality of the communication, the stakeholder levels of risk, and negotiation and problem solving results. And again, are we successfully resolving the problems that we're faced with? And the last thing we need to take into account when we talk about stakeholders is the code of ethics. That's really important for a project manager because this is really the values, the definition, and the description. This is where the code of ethics comes into place as project manager. This is where you really need to know that your value has to be responsibility, respect, fairness, and honesty. And ownership of your action and your decision, treatment of people and resource, making impartial decision, understanding the truth and the truth-based action, and again, honoring commitment and upholding legal and ethical rules. This is sometimes difficult, when you work with people who have different views than you. Having good faith, being non-abusive, and respect for the resources, having transparency, of handling conflict of interest and proper motive and decision, and then having no deceptions or dishonest behavior. So that's why most of us are professional project manager, because we try to adhere to this code of ethics as much as we probably can and try to make the community and the profession so we can manage the stakeholder in a proper way. Next week, we are going to quickly go over the new updates for the PMBOK 7 that's coming up. And I'm also going to talk to you about, there's a few important information coming in from PMI about applying for certification. There's a change in your application that's coming to effect actually next week. And there's other stuff that are going to come in that have been pushed to December. So I'm going to briefly go over that. We're going to talk about a little bit of survey and see how people like this presentation. And we're also going to try to see what you want to do in the fall, if people can let us know about how this is going. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat or send it to me. You can also send it to website or to president@pmi-mcac.org. Let me know what we can do to help. So have a wonderful week. See you next week. And next week is the last one for this session. We'll start the other one in August. So nice presenting to you today. Have a wonderful week, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.